BBC News at midday. Mrs Thatcher, Britain's longest-serving Prime Minister this century, has announced her resignation, and Mr Douglas Hurd and Mr John Major have thrown their hats into the ring. Mrs Thatcher announced in a statement this morning that she would be resigning as Prime Minister as soon as a new Conservative leader had been elected. She said she would not be contesting the second ballot next Tuesday. Nominations have just closed. We're going over to Westminster and John Harrison.
The end of Margaret Thatcher and the end of an era. After 11 years in Downing Street, after 3 general election victories, Mrs Thatcher in the end was left with no choice but to stand down. It was not just Michael Heseltine's challenge, it was the fact that the Prime Minister had lost the confidence of too many Conservative MPs and, crucially, too many members of her own cabinet. The Prime Minister had hoped to risk a second ballot fight with Mr Heseltine next Tuesday. But with party unity at stake, if not the outcome of the next general election, Mrs Thatcher, under pressure, decided early this morning to resign. She informed the Queen and the Cabinet. At which point attention switched to who would now take on Mr Heseltine. The nominations have just closed and the names submitted: the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, sponsored by the Environment Secretary Chris Patten and Defence Secretary Tom King, and the Chancellor John Major, nominated by his Chief Secretary at the Treasury Norman Lamont and the Agriculture Minister John Gummer. Just for good measure, the Prime Minister made clear through Downing Street that she hoped a Cabinet Minister would succeed her. In other words, stop Heseltine. Mrs Thatcher, of course, remains Prime Minister until a successor is elected. She must therefore take Prime Minister's questions in the Commons in just over 3 hours' time and respond in a debate on Labour's motion of no confidence in the government. All this with Neil Kinnock demanding an immediate general election to allow the voters at large to decide who, in the longer term, should occupy 10 Downing Street.
Mr Kenneth Clarke, the Education Secretary and former Health Secretary, was at this morning's Cabinet meeting where Mrs Thatcher announced her intention to resign. He said she'd made a selfless decision in the interests of the party, the government and the causes she believed in.
Well, it was a very emotional, historic occasion this morning because we'd all served under her for many years and very proud to do so. And she decided in a very typical way that the Cabinet were united in wanting to carry on the work, bring the party together, stop this fratricidal warfare and get on with, firstly, the task of running the country properly and tackling the great issues of Europe and the economy and the crisis in the Gulf, and having the opportunity of coming together under a leader who will carry on the work. Hence, Douglas Hurd will be standing, who's a world statesman with his views on Europe, which I think command wide support in the party. John Major, whose economic policies are not in doubt. The party must now choose, and the message coming out of this morning's meeting was, will the party choose calmly and sensibly, unite behind a new leader, and then get down to the real task of carrying on governing this country in such a way as to ensure our re-election in whatever time it is, up to 18 months away.
Mr Michael Heseltine, the former Defence Secretary whose challenge for the leadership brought down Mrs Thatcher, was among the first to react publicly to the news. He paid tribute to her 11.5 years as Prime Minister.
May I say at once that this brings to an end a quite remarkable premiership. She has made a remarkable contribution to Britain's history and has led this country with great distinction in the 1980s. The resignation about which we've just heard now opens the way for an election for the vacancy of leader of the Conservative Party, which will enable others to come forward. I very much welcome that. I would expect my own name to be still there, as it has already been nominated, and we will then find a way of uniting the Conservative Party and of going on to win the next general election.
The man who would have run Mrs Thatcher's campaign for the second ballot, the Energy Secretary, Mr John Wakeham, has spoken of her feelings after the announcement of her resignation. He said she was preparing to defend the government against Labour's motion of no confidence in the Commons this afternoon.
Her mood is, like always, she does her duty. She's, of course she's sad, but she has remarkable powers of recovery, and I've had a look at the speech for this afternoon, and it's a pretty good speech.
Lord Whitelaw, the former Deputy Prime Minister, gave his reaction to the resignation from his London home.
I feel it's a very sad day for people like me who have worked so closely with her over many years. But I think our main feeling would be one of immense gratitude for what she has done for our country and our party in a remarkable career as Prime Minister.
Mr Neil Kinnock said millions of people throughout Britain had been waiting for a long time for Mrs Thatcher to go, and it was very good news that she had resigned. The Conservative Party, he said, was split irrevocably, and he called for an immediate general election. However, he added that for the first time in his life he had admiration for Mrs Thatcher because she had put loyalty to her party before vanity. The Liberal Democrats leader, Mr Paddy Ashdown, welcomed Mrs Thatcher's decision, but said he was sorry it had taken her so long. It was now time for Britain to turn its attention to the issues of the 1990s. Mrs Thatcher is due in the Commons later this afternoon, but at the moment she has more immediate concerns. This report from Westminster from Richard Bailey.
Within the next half hour, Mrs Thatcher will be on her way to Buckingham Palace, where she will formally convey to the Queen her decision to resign. She will still, however, be Prime Minister, returning to Downing Street over lunchtime, and then, as normal for a Thursday afternoon, Mrs Thatcher will be driven to Parliament. At 3:15, she will take Prime Minister's question time, and then, an hour or so later, she will make her last Commons speech as Prime Minister, replying to the motion of censure which has been put down by Labour. But Margaret Thatcher will remain Prime Minister until the result of next Tuesday's ballot is known. Then, a further royal audience will be sought. The Queen will accept her resignation, surrendering the seals of office as First Lord of the Treasury. The Queen will then call on whoever wins the ballot to form a new administration.
The initial reaction in the city to Mrs Thatcher's imminent departure was a surge in share prices, though it has now petered out. There'll be a special programme about the resignation of Mrs Thatcher on Radio 4 FM beginning at 3 o'clock. It'll include live coverage of Prime Minister's questions and the start of a debate on the Labour motion of no confidence. BBC Radio News.